In this video, we're going to talk about how to use sketching and extrusions to create a 3D component for the robot. In this case, we're going to be making a servo mount. So when you first come into Fusion, this is the home view of the work plane. And what you want to do is come up here to this Create menu and click on Create Sketch. And then select the plane that you want to work on, and then here we are. So the first thing we want to do is we want to use some basic shapes to create the body that we're going to extrude. So let's just use some rectangles to make our servo mount. Let's start up here for one, and let's make one right here, and let's make one right here. So that's how you use the rectangle tool, and as you can see, I've already made the basic shape that's going to happen. This inner rectangle is going to become the hole where the servo sits. So once you have all your rectangles laid out or your shapes laid out, they're all blue, which means that they are unconstrained and they can move in any direction. So in order to basically control or actually dimension out what your 3D part is going to look like, you need to use the dimension tool and constraints. So this constraints menu has a bunch of constraints that'll help you gain control of your sketch and kind of move things where they need to be. And this dimension tool is for sizing out parts of the sketch that correspond to real world measurements. Like say this post, we're going to dimension it by selecting these 2 points, and then we're going to drag it up here, hit 10, because it's going to be 10 millimeters. But actually, before we do that, let's constrain these sketches to the origin. That way we can have just a little bit more organization here. Once a sketch component, aka a line, is constrained, it turns black, and that means it just can't move from that point, whereas these blue lines, they can. So let's just start putting down some sketch dimensions. I'll make that 10 millimeters, and you can see that line just became constrained. From this point to this point, this is going to need to be 40.3 long, okay? And this point to this point can be 28. From this point to this point, we can be 4 millimeters. And this point to this point can be 10. And same thing over here. We're going to use dimension, make it 10. Okay, so already our sketch is constrained with real-world dimensions. Okay, so now we're going to select the center diameter circle, and we're going to place some holes around our servo mount. These circles are going to turn into bolt holes, which we'll mount the servo with in real life. So we've created some random circles. Now we need to make sure that they're in the right place. So the way we do that is, again, using constraints. So first of all, let's create something that will help make life easier for us later on. And that is a construction line. So I've selected the line tool up here. And over here on the right sketch palette, you can check construction, or you can press X. That toggles it on or off. And this basically creates a line that is just used for constraints and stuff. It doesn't actually have any effect on anything. It's just for making life easier when you're sketching. Okay, so now let's take a construction line and put it between these 2 circles here. So one here, hit the check. Now the next important constraint we want to go over is the horizontal vertical, and this just ensures that any lines that you want to be horizontal or vertical are actually that way. So let's hit it. As you can see, it moved straight up and down now. And why don't we take an equals constraint, or actually, let's make another line between over here. So what we can do now is we can use this equals constraint, and we could transfer the properties of that line to this line. Okay, another thing we want to dimension out is the diameter of these bolt holes, which are going to be 4 millimeters in diameter for each of them. So instead of changing each of them one by one, we're just going to change one. So let's just select dimension, select this. Go ahead up here, and I'll just put it right here. make it 4, exactly. So now this circle's dimensioned. And now let's use an equal constraint and put it on each of these circles. Okay, so that means that whenever I change this dimension, all these corresponding circles will change, which is what we want. Okay, and now we need to figure out where these circles, because they can still move around all over the place. Let's first find out how far apart they need to be from each other, because as you can see, they're kind of all over the place. Okay, so I just checked the measurements of the servo, and these circles need to be exactly 9.9. And as you can see, this also changed. So now I can still move these circles around, but the distance between them won't change. Okay, so the next thing we want to figure out is how far away from this inner edge do these holes need to be in order to mount correctly. And when you're mounting, and when you're creating bolt holes to mount stuff onto, you want to make sure you check every single axis. Because if you're off in one axis, then you won't be able to mount it properly. So we got to make sure that it's constrained, not just to each other, but up and down. How far is it from this edge? How far is it from this edge? How far is it from this edge? Etc. So it turns out it's 3.85 millimeters from this edge to this edge. So yeah, we can use the dimension tool, select the center of our circle, select the edge we want to constrain it to, and let's go up here, 3.85, and as you can see, it moves over. We could also do this with a construction line, so we don't have to have 2 dimensions. In fact, let's do that. So I'm going to delete this dimension. Instead, let's create a construction line from this point to this point. Bit hard to see. Let's just hit the sketch dimension, and let's try and select this construction line. Okay, so now what we're able to do is copy this this construction line over here by using an equal constraint. Okay, so let's go here, select equal, select this line. Let's go ahead and make this the same size. Okay, so now they're perfectly aligned this way. They can only move up and down now. Okay, so we're good in one dimension. They can no longer move side to side, and they can no longer move apart from each other, but they still can move up and down. So what we're going to want to do is constrain these bolt holes to the bottom of this, because if you think about it, if we constrain these holes to the top, they could end up having the servo float if it's off by like a millimeter or 2. So what we want to do, since the servo is going to rest at the bottom anyway, let's put the bolt holes, constrain them to this bottom part. Now the way we're going to do this is again by using a construction line from this bottom edge to that. And then similarly over here. Let's go there. Okay. Okay, now let's make a construction line from this bottom center point to this other construction line. And as you can see, it makes a perpendicular constraint. And again on this side. Okay, now let's dimension this construction line. And this dimension is going to be 4.6. Okay, let's make it equal using an equal constraint over here and over here. Okay, perfect. So we've run into a problem. I noticed that over here, these circles turn black, which means they're now fully constrained in place. But these over here are not constrained, because as you can see, they can still move up and down as this changes, which means that we need to constrain this construction line more. So let's apply a horizontal constraint, and now the holes are in the perfect spot. And the last thing we want to do is add some more bolt holes. So let's click our circle diameter tool and just make some. Oh, as you can see, it's a construction line, so I need to undo that. And over here. Okay, so now it's a normal one. And let's just add some holes that need to be mounted. In this case, I'm not going to use a construction line, and that's because it's only in one place. But just for the sake of continuity, we're going to do it in case maybe we want to add another bolt hole later. So it's just about convenience at this point. Make sure the construction line is horizontal or vertical. Let's dimension one of these circles to be 4 millimeters. Okay, and then come up here, equals constraint, pop, pop, and let's just do some arbitrary dimensions. We're going to give it a 5mm clearance. And we're going to make this line exactly 16. Now, we should be good. What you'll notice is that these can still move around, and that's because we haven't constrained them to the edge. So now let's dimension this circle to the edge. And what we can actually do instead, to get it perfectly centered, let's create another construction line. And that triangle, when it shows up, it snaps to that point. That means it's the center point. So we're just going to quickly create a center point all the way down, which might be helpful later. And then we can either do a coincident, a collinear constraint. So let's just try the coincident. So let's just put that on this line. And as you can see, the circles can't move side to side any longer. But one thing they can do is move up and down. And that's just because this top bar is blue. So why don't we drag them down a bit? And it's okay to leave a blue line. It doesn't really matter, but overall you want to have everything constrained just so that you know everything's in the right place. But in this case, this is an arbitrary length, so it doesn't really matter where it is. Okay, now we're going to click Finish Sketch up here, and we'll return to our work plane. And we're no longer in sketch mode because we have all these different tools up here. Let's go up here, select Home, and you can see that we just have a 2D shape right now. And in our timeline, it shows we created our first sketch. So Servo mount. And the next step to making a 3D shape is to extrude our sketch. So let's go ahead, select all the faces that we want to extrude, and then we can either drag this arrow or we can enter in a value. I'm going to enter in 19. So on our timeline, we added another extrude. The last steps to creating a nice clean 3D form is to fillet the edges, which basically rounds any harsh corners that you don't want. So I'm going to select the corners that I don't want to be so sharp. And we're just going to round them slightly. Another thing you can do, it's kind of personal preference, but it also removes sharp edges. Select the outer edges and hit chamfer. Let's actually zoom in to do this one. As you can see, I just got it from the modify menu right here, and I'm just going to lightly chamfer the edges so it's not so harsh. And if I want to make a change to this, the best way to do it is to go back into the timeline and click Edit Feature, or just double click. And now we're back into our sketch menu, and we can add another circle. Now you notice it doesn't show up. Well, that's because we haven't modified the extrude that we did previously. So let's go back into the extrude by double clicking. Click on that, and you'll see that now it considers it in part of the extrude. So that's pretty much the extent of what you need to know. Of course, there's a bunch of videos going over all the sketch constraints, which you should know, and all the sketch tools. But basically, you just sketch a shape, go back to your 3D mode, extrude it, and then finalize by cleaning up stuff, maybe making it look nicer, and you're pretty much done.